r/askreddit. What's the most fucked up thing you've ever did/saw? The most fucked up thing I've seen was a guy who had just been in a motorcycle accident bleeding out on the side of the freeway. He was clenching onto the hand of the girl who was the driver of the car involved. She was crying hysterically. I saw his hand turn white in a matter of seconds. I remember it whenever I see someone on a bike. I saw my little brother getting hit by a car and flying a few meters through the air when he was only 6 years old. Fortunately he didn't even break a bone, but damn, I'll never forget this. Found my grandpa with a self-inflicted shotgun blast to the head. Still alive, unconscious. I was less traumatized by that than my family's shock reactions. Saw a kid I knew get hit by a car, flip through the air, jump up and picked up one of his shoes and then collapse and got airlifted out. The rest of us were sitting on the corner eating hamburgers. Never saw him again. They said he was paralyzed. Edit, didn't expect this to get attention. I brought his banged up bike and glasses and shoes back to my house, but they never got picked up. My dad was on the volunteer fire department and managed the medevac landing and was first on scene because we only lived a few doors down. I witnessed a bad car accident once. The car launched off of an overpass as I went under it. The car flipped several times. It was like something out of a movie. I was the first person on the scene. My wife called 911. It was not a pretty sight. The first thing I remember seeing was a severed arm beside the road. There wasn't much left of the person's body. I tripped over a dead body in tall grass working an accident trying to find the missing passenger. It was 3 a.m. and raining. Fatal hit and run vehicle accident that happened in front of me. A car got struck by someone who ran a red light. The truck at fault basically slowed down a second and then drove away. I stopped to check on the people in the car. It was a couple of teens, the guy having substantial leg injuries and the girl was unconscious and losing a lot of blood. Like, her pants, seat, and floor carpet were becoming saturated with it. She basically stopped breathing and lost her pulse before the ambulance got there. The guy was crying and begging for me to help her, though there wasn't much I could do. Once she was loaded on the ambulance, the guy started pacing around, on his bad leg, and basically having a panic attack. The ambulance crew and some firefighters were mostly busy with the girl, so me and one other firefighter were trying to calm the guy down. He finally collapsed in pain and another ambulance arrived to get him taken care of. I remember getting in my car to drive home, turning the radio off, having a "what the fuck just happened" moment, then driving home in silence while trying to process it. Didn't get much sleep that night, obviously. I later learned that they never got her pulse back. She was either 15 or 16 years old. Don't remember exactly. When I was 22 on Nye, I ended up in the hospital for alcohol poisoning. In the bed next to me was a 16-year-old kid for the same thing. His friends were scared to call for help when he collapsed, so he wasn't transported until hours later when his older brother came home. His BAC was slightly lower than mine was .382, so I don't really know how I came out okay, but he was brain dead. Listened to his parents discuss organ donation before he was taken off life support. Grabbed my son. The split second we were hit by a speeding car when he got off of his school bus. Had I not taken all impact, he'd be dead. He has a TBI from hitting the ground though. He lost adult teeth, he was 10, and road rash. I had to stumble and crawl to him breathless while a bus full of school children were screaming, having witnessed it. He's alive and thriving. This was December 2021. I worked for a horse training ranch for a month when I was a kid. Me and the dude I worked with found a cow that had been dead for a while out in the field. It was bloated and gonna blow soon. We did not engage with the cow, we weren't prepared for a cleanup that day. When we came back prepared for cleaning the next day, it had ruptured and the smell was life-changing. It was spiritually bad. Since I was basically an unpaid intern, the paid guys told me to take a hike. 14-year-old me took a hike. I was a hard-working kid and they knew it, so let me off with that one. I once saw a woman who was stuck with her arm in a hydraulic press. It came out all flat and I cannot delete this image from my mind. Arm was removed from her body after surgery. The two guys welded to a pole. The supply voltage to the overhead wires on the Melbourne, Australia, metropolitan train system is 1500 VDC. God knows how many amps. A fuckton, anyway. DC current grabs and holds. They tried to steal the copper. They failed. The current has grabbed them and boiled them dry. All the visceral fluids were gone. My story seems pretty lame after reading some of these stories. I saw a guy get his hand eaten by the Gatling gun on an A-10 aircraft in 1981. He had his hand/arm stuck in the gun for at least 6 hours while medial people were shooting him up with painkillers. They had no clue how to get him it without amputating his hand. They ended up taking the gun out of the aircraft. Understand, this is a big fucking gun, like the size of one of the old VW Bugs. They took the gun apart as much as they could and medevaced him out with this gearbox that had to weigh 200 pounds on his hand. I saw this guy about 6 months later, just before I transferred to another base. He had this giant bandage on his hand with 4 fingers and a thumb sticking out of it. Not sure how well everything worked, but he did have his fingers. Saw a guy run over by an 18-wheeler. Turned his head into red clay with a perfect tire track mark straight across. Watching a car traveling at about 130 miles per hour in my rear view mirror almost hit me, but instead hit the base of a bridge, the crunching sound and bodies flying everywhere, then total silence. Worked in a gas station in 80s, some guy came in after midnight and bought a cigarette lighter. He walked outside and went over to one of the gas pumps and pumped gas all over himself. Set himself on fire after that. After I tripped, the emergency shut off for the pumps. Me and another customer ran outside. The customer tried to put the fire out on the guy with his jacket, and I used a fire extinguisher on the other things that was on fire. Eventually we succeed, but the guy was seriously burned all over. This was the 80s, so most of his clothes was of synthetic fabric that had melted into his flesh. His face was kind of melted too. The ambulance came really quick and he was taken away. He didn't die, but I never saw him again. I talked to some cops a while later and they said that he was on probation and was protesting about his treatment and tried to commit suicide. I found my best friend with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He put a blanket over his head and used trash bags as basically a tarp. His mom called me and was very concerned about how he was talking recently. Nothing suicidal, just different from how he would normally talk with her. He begged her to stay home from school a couple days after his mom called me. She told him he has to go, but she leaves for work before he goes to school. So he lied and was saying he was at school. The mom got a call from the apartment next to her asking what Alex is doing walking by the highway. She then called me to ask if he was at school. I said no, he wasn't in first or second hour. She started freaking out and was pleading for someone to go check on him. She works hours away from the apartment. My school was only 15 to 20 minutes away from the apartment. Not once ever did I think he was depressed or suicidal, nor did he ever have a bad day, it seemed like. Always making people laugh and could hold a conversation like no other. I learned that day you never know what demons people are facing. I have a key to the apartment, so I unlocked the door and walk in, and I proceeded to say an inside joke as a way to announce myself. I walk right past the living room and went to his room, and he was not in the room. Went downstairs where he hangs out. Wasn't down there. Peeked my head around the wall to do a quick check in the living room because that is the last place he ever goes. When I walked past earlier, I thought the plastic trash bags were a sheet. I only caught it out the corner of my eye walking up the stairs to his room. The amount of blood and brain matter that was on his lap is something I can never get out of my head. As well with the phone call with his mom letting her know. Hearing a mother's loss is the most primal, animalistic scream you will ever hear. Saw someone hit a guardrail on the interstate going 90 miles per hour. It ripped the door right off, and the look of shock on her face when I caught up matched mine. A girl was trying to kill herself. She broke a window, took a shard and cut her arms open. Then she locked the door and sat against it so her dead weight would keep it closed as people were trying to break in. The others went looking for help to break the door in, and I sat on the other side of the door talking to her, trying to get her to open it, as her blood seeped out from beneath the door. We got the door open and she lived. It was the blood coming under the door, knowing she was dying, that was just, I don't know, fucking hardcore fucked up. Watched my sister get impaled and killed by a tree. Context: we lived at the bottom of a huge hill. The back walls of our house were touching the ground, basically. One day we were playing in the laundry room when we heard a weird snap, and seconds later a huge oak tree came crashing down through the roof and one of the branches went through her back. She was screaming, but only for like 4 seconds. It was like the air just got sucked out of her. Neighbors came running over, and all I remember after that is getting scooped up by the neighbor and then waking up in the hospital. It's been 17 years. Through therapy and time, I'm more than okay to speak about it. Life goes on, and so must we all. Edit. I'm sorry if I respond in the same way to everyone. I've never been able to figure out a good response when people say I'm sorry. White heart. Saw. I was sitting in a cafe in a busy city center one time. A homeless couple were walking down the street. He had a very unstable and aggressive demeanor. She was scantily clad and every inch of visible flesh was covered in bruises. She was walking hand in hand with him, looking terrified, holding a bunch of flowers. I can't know for sure what the context of the situation was, but it looked absolutely heartbreaking. The streets were absolutely packed with people, but these two had a large empty bubble of space around them as they went. They saw an intellectually disabled diabetic woman with maggots in her scalp. They had actually burrowed into the skull. On the same woman I had to douse her head in turpentine oil and pull out dead/immobilized maggots with forceps. It took me an hour and a half of tolerating the smell of turpentine, pus, and necrotic flesh. Found a dead body on the sidewalk in front of my building on my third day living in NYC. When I told my supervisor about it at work, hoping to process it with someone, she just kind of brushed it off like welcome to New York. I saw a girl shoot heroin from a Snapple cap at a house party when I was in high school. You could see the plastic/waxy sealant layer on the underside of the inverted cap blackening and pulling apart from the heat while submerged in the junk. An elderly got ran over by a motorcycle. He was in such a bad state and I could see his bones sticking out. The best I could do was redirect cars going toward his direction and accompanying him before medics arrived. My grandmother had a series of strokes that left her barely coherent. All my so-called family decided that they could not help take care of her except my cousin and myself. Bathing and cleaning her as a late teen was traumatic to say the least. But seeing this family just bail because it was too hard on them. $K them. As a truck driver I have seen some pretty nasty stuff out there. Probably the worst was a motorcycle with a teen girl passenger come tearing down the middle between lane in stopped traffic. Driver lost it sideswiping into a pickup. Both driver and the girl had legs torn off before they crashed into school bus full of grade school kids. The faces of those children will haunt me forever. Was a young guy rabbit hunting in Kentucky and found a human skull with bullet holes in it. Some guy murdered his wife but told people she ran off with her boyfriend. I worked IT within law enforcement for 15 years, so I saw a lot of screwed up shit. Had to pull 911 calls where people died while on the line, would have to listen to make sure I pulled all the right lines, as well as radio traffic, and I've had to pull a shit ton of video from the jail the department I worked at ran. Was in part of the building one day and saw an inmate get shanked about 20 feet away from me. Guy was stabbed over a dozen times before guards got them separated. One of the most fucked up was a time I had to pull video for an inmate suicide where the guy hung himself in a cell. Guards were not doing their jobs and checking these inmates and cells every 30 minutes as required. Guards of course reported that they were doing the checks, but when I pulled the video I found out they weren't. Dude hung himself in the cell and was hanging for 10 hours before the next shift came in. The guard coming on shift was doing the right thing and checking every cell and inmate to start his shift, so of course he found him hanging and didn't know when it had happened, so rushed in to cut him down to start CPR, but dude was already long dead. Guard not doing their rounds got fired, but I was so pissed after pulling that video. What grenades do to a human body. Context: Iraq, 2005. I am a pilot and was competing with two other teammates during an air race where we fly to specific airports and try to be the fastest. 2 days before this week-long race took place, one of my teammates came to me crying, saying their significant other, who is also a pilot, was just in a plane crash and isn't responding to texts. All the info we had were news articles. The news articles read 1 dead, 1 critically injured, and we had no idea which one was which. We spent hours trying to get more info through their friends and family and the news articles. Then as we were sitting in the hotel lobby, another competitor who was aware of the situation found an article that said 2 dead after place crash and showed it to our teammate. That's when it hit me, they died. They really just died. I watched my teammate read the article headline about 5 times and deny that it wasn't real. They just walked away outside and we all started crying. A fucking news article had to tell them, their significant other just died. I'll never forget listening to them call the coroner and ask if it was real. Hearing the screams and cries in the hotel room, I never want to watch someone go through those emotions firsthand again. Fucked up thing. That damn earthquake I saw yesterday, my building was about to collapse and all I did was freeze. I was the captain of a snowboard team and we were practicing backflips. An 18-year-old skier rode up and asked whether he could practice with us. He landed on his head. I was first to him and asked him whether he could feel his legs. He said yeah. In the time between then and when ski patrol showed up with the sled, he had lost feeling in his legs. Seeing someone that young realize they were paralyzed was heartbreaking. He quickly went into shock. Watched a guy on a bike T-bone a car that was turning left as the yellow light changed. He was ducked in that low air resistance downhill pose. His arm went through his chest. On Mother's Day last year a bunch of cops showed up at my neighbor's house. We saw our neighbor get put in an ambulance but they cops weren't leaving. About an hour later we heard a woman yelling, "Why won't anyone tell me what's going on?" A few minutes later the coroner showed up. They came out of the house a few moments later and talked to two women who was now in front of my house. She let out the most painful cry I've ever heard and dropped to her knees in the middle of the street. Her 18-year-old son was inside. He had OD'd on Mother's Day. I will never forget the pain in her cries. I saw my friend's dad explode from about a mile away, years before I met said friend. Basically a guy was driving a tanker truck, hauling gasoline, and he got stuck on a RR. Train couldn't stop in time, and he was still in the cab when the train made contact. Something like 6 or 7 other people in the stalled traffic were incinerated. I saw the explosion while in traffic from about a mile or less away. It was like something out of Hollywood. I actually wondered if it was a movie filming. This is South Florida after all. It would be 5 years later that I would meet that guy's son in a completely different part of the state. He never was able to get over what happened, and how much was blamed on his dad. He resorted to self-harm a lot. He often called me in the middle of the night, ranging from incoherent ramblings, to expressions of love and gratitude for being there for him, to needing to be talked down from more harmful acts. He died just a few years ago. I think he OD'd. We never got the full story, his family were tight-lipped. Honestly, that whole trajectory between father and son's untimely and tragic deaths, about 27 or 28 years, is probably the worst thing I've witnessed, in various ways, in my life. And very sad. Sat in 20 minutes of traffic out in the middle of nowhere, and when I finally got to the accident, there were bodies and parts thrown all over the desert, 4 wrecked vehicles and all-out panic while everyone was trying to help the people in the wreck. Rode my bicycle past an accident scene. Apparently the pedestrian was run over by a heavy vehicle. Didn't see the body, but pretty sure what I saw scattered on the ground were bits of brain matter. I once saw a guy fall 40+ feet. He climbed to the top of a rock climbing wall, then let go thinking he was clipped in. He wasn't. Poor guy broke a lot of bones. He quit climbing after that. He was a really good climber too. Also once in the hood I saw a cop run over a dog then drive off, all done in front of a bunch of kids playing. One of the most disturbing things I ever witnessed was a distressed man seconds away from committing suicide by jumping in front of a subway train. He walked over the edge of the platform, dangled his legs off the side and looked down the tunnel to see if there was a train coming. There was. He sat there thinking about it for about 10 seconds, and with just seconds to spare, he backed away. I'm glad he didn't jump. Hope he's doing okay today. Had to carry a dead 3-year-old drowning victim from the Peds ER to the morgue, wrapped in a sheet. Summer in Florida, so he was still very warm. Didn't realize it gave me PTSD until I picked up my daughter 12 years later. She was 6 months old, picked her up from bath and wrapped her in her little towel, walking to the bed to dry and change, and boom. There are so many people who have seen so much more fucked up things. I've seen a lot more gore. But that did it, the most fucked up thing, and I didn't even realize it at the time.